Like much of Kayo Chingonyi's poetry, The Colour of James Brown's Scream explores music, its history, its influences, and how it shapes our identity. It's taken from his collection Kumukanda, and it is in fact the first poem in the collection. Now, you may be watching this video because you are studying the collection, which is fantastic. What I want to do is go through the poem and discuss some of its central ideas. I'm not going to be identifying every single poetic technique because I don't think that's in anyone's interests. Instead, I want to explore the tensions and context of the poem, and I hope it will be useful for you to develop your own interpretation of this wonderful poem. Now, if you still haven't read it in full by yourself, I would suggest that you pause the video now and do just that. And also, if I mention anything that you have a comment on or want to say something about, please leave them in the comments below. I would love to read what you have to say. Now, where else to begin but the title itself, which is repeated later in the poem, The Colour of James Brown's Scream. So straight away, the reference to James Brown just jumps out, and it's the first of many cultural allusions that Chingonyi uses throughout the poem. I'm going to talk more about what an allusion is and how it's used later. But for now, we need to recognize that James Brown is one of the originators of funk and soul music, and this choice is no coincidence. Now, the poem is deeply concerned with cultural heritage and inheritance of one way or another, and even the word colour seems to gesture towards ideas of racial identity. And I think there's an important question here of the role that culture plays in constructing and expressing identity. But the title works on another level too. A scream is a sound, but colour is something we perceive through sight. So we have this contrast of colour and the scream itself. So this could be seen as an example of synesthesia, where one sense is blended with another. A blending or intermingling of different sense modalities. Now, this is sort of a sensory crossover, sight as sound or taste as sight, and it's a classic creative technique that just makes sense if you excuse the pun. A really good modern example of this would be the film Ratatouille, where as taste is being explored, we get all these visual and musical effects. And the idea of boundaries breaking down or connections being made across different senses or experiences is actually central to this poem, and we're going to see that more clearly as we explore the body of the poem in more detail. The last thing to mention is just that this poem has a dedication for Steve McCarthy and Todd Bracey. In an interview, the poet spoke about this and said that, you know, these two people are friends of a friend who actually spent time at the nightclub, the Paradise Garage, where Larry Levan was resident DJ. We're going to talk more about this nightclub in just a short moment, but I suppose there's something interesting here in that this poem is connected to actual lived experiences through this dedication that it begins with. Something for you to reflect on, perhaps, of what this contributes to the poem. First of all, let's listen to Kayo Chingonyi actually performing it.
The Colour of James Brown's Scream. I have known you by many names, but today you are Larry Levan, your hand on the platter in the smoky room of a garage regular's memory. You're keeping when doves cry in time as you swing your hips and sweat drips from your hair, the colour of James Brown's Scream.
As I've mentioned, the first thing here that I think really jumps out at the beginning of this poem is this mention of Larry Levan, the Paradise Garage, and also When Doves Cry by Prince. The poet sets the scene. We're in this very specific nightclub at a very specific moment in time, and this very specific song is playing. And as I've already mentioned, this is an example of allusion. It's a poetic technique, and it plays a really important role in this poem and elsewhere in the Kumukanda collection. This poem, I think, is all about cultural connections and different sorts of connections. And what's really important here is that all the allusions that Chingonyi makes hold a particular resonance and meaning. The first one here is Larry Levan and Paradise Garage. This is a mythical nightclub that opened in New York in the 1970s. And it was a space that was basically much more than just a nightclub. It was a symbol for community, release, and alternative ways of being. So the garage was a hugely important place where many societal barriers were broken down, such as between white people and people of color, or between straight and LGBTQ communities. And this was a place that offered safety and self-expression for many people who couldn't find it elsewhere. And that's where this poem is set, as it were.
How important was the garage to New York? New York was the garage was the only place where people could come be who they wanted to be. After the week was over, they came and they partied all night long.
Now, similarly, the reference to Prince affirms an alternative view of masculinity. So Prince's image, whilst being a global pop star, was built on a kind of ambiguity. He actively blurred the lines between masculine and feminine ideals. And this record, When Doves Cry, was one of the true crossover hits of its time. It was played on both mainstream radio stations and in underground nightclubs like The Garage. So in this poem, we're transported to a nightclub, to a particular moment in history where new forms of masculinity, particularly black masculinity, were emerging. And this was a time and a place where freedom and expression were at the forefront. However, while this poem is about Larry Levan at this particular moment, this today, it's not just a simple portrait. So this poem begins being addressed to someone or something else. I have known you by many names, but today you are Larry Levan. And we only really discover who this you is a bit later in the poem. It's not just Larry Levan. It creates this really mysterious, almost ghostly beginning to the poem, as if the speaker is speaking directly to a sort of presence that is only taking the form of a DJ at this moment in time. And beyond that, we're not really in the nightclub at all. We're actually inside the memory of a regular. Even though we're a few lines into the poem, Chingonyi isn't just playing with sensory details by having the colour of James Brown's Scream. He's also playing with time and space and memory. And I think these boundaries between the past and the present, between sound and feeling, and the fact that these boundaries are blurring is actually a really important thematic element of the poem. Obviously, as I've mentioned, there's a great deal of musical referencing in the poem, but there's also a great deal of musicality. And we can see that from the very opening lines. So it's written in free verse, which means there's no recognizable meter, there's no regular rhyme scheme. And I think what we see is Kayo Chingonyi using lots of rhyme and assonance in particular to create rhythm and to create, like I said, I think the best word is a sense of musicality. Let's have a look at these sort of repeated vowel sounds as we work through. Many names, but today you are Larry Levan, your hand on the platter in the smoky room of a garage regular's memory. You are keeping When Doves Cry in time as you swing your hips and sweat drips from your hair, the colour of James Brown's Scream. Now, I was sort of overemphasizing it then, but I think this is really deliberate. And as we hear the poem aloud, we hear these different sounds come and go, and perhaps it wouldn't be too far to suggest this is almost like a DJ set itself. It's almost like we're hearing different tracks being faded in and out. And it's also important to note how the placement of these rhymes and echoed sounds generates a sort of syncopated rhythm, and it gives the poem a sort of groove. It's like a pulsing, offbeat flow, and it feels very much in tune with the music the poem references. In fact, in many ways, this brings us right back to James Brown and the roots of funk and soul and dance music. Here we have Bootsy Collins, who was for a long time James Brown's bassist, talking about how James Brown as a band leader would build rhythm by emphasizing the downbeat and then playing syncopated rhythms around it.
Oh, hit me! That's the one. That's the one. I say, oh, I think I understand.
And of course, creating rhythms with rhymes and with words is also at the foundation of rap music and all hip hop, but perhaps that's something we can explore more fully in a future video. Moving on, Paradise Garage, my accent getting in the way there, is located on King Street. So we begin this next section with the King of King Street, and we think that is inevitably Larry Levan. But notice here how the poem sort of shifts. The focus begins to shift a little bit here. Let's hear the poet perform again.
King of King Street. We're still moving to the same sound, though some of us don't know it is your grave we dance on. Cutting shapes, machismo lost to the beat. Every roadman is a sweet boy if the DJ plays Heartbroken. At just the right time for these jaded feet.
So, what began as a sort of singular personal memory of a nightclub is now expanding into something much bigger. The poet starts discussing what's happening right now. We are still moving, and we are moving from an individual reflection in the memory of a regular to speaking on behalf of a wider community through the use of that collective pronoun we. And this transition from the past to the present is reinforced by this phrase here, the same sound. And you hear how that sibilance actually creates a continuation that almost feels seamless. And I think it emphasizes the ongoing influence and legacy of black music, how one generation influence and inherits from the one or the ones before. While this moment does feel like a celebration of musical heritage, there's also something unsettling beneath the surface. There's this phrase here, "It is your grave we dance on." Now, to dance on someone's grave is an idiom, but traditionally it's not an act of celebration, it's actually of disrespect. It's this idea that we might be happy about someone's downfall or death. And in the context of this poem, Chingonyi seems to suggest that those who now enjoy and inherit the musical legacy that was laid down by Larry Levan and the people, or even further back, perhaps by James Brown himself, some of the people who are enjoying this legacy may not be fully aware of where it came from or who was responsible for it. It is your grave we dance on. So there's a tension here between joy and ignorance, between celebration of a culture and the erasure of a culture. Now, the use of enjambment here in the middle, "it is your grave we dance on," really forces us to sort of feel the tension of this sort of metaphor and this idiom. And it'd be an interesting question for you to answer maybe in the comments. What do you think of this? What do you think it means for the legacy of black music? And why does the poet feel like we're dancing on people's graves? This section of the poem focuses much more on the transformative effects of music and dance in particular. The use of this dash at the end of the line makes us pause on this. Machismo lost to the beat. And for those that don't know, machismo is a form of, exaggerated masculine pride, over the top masculine energy. Sometimes we just short it down to very macho. But I think this idea of machismo is also related to sort of aggression and perhaps a confrontational attitude. Chingonyi writes that machismo lost to the beat, and then we pause, and then we actually get this emphasis through, again, the use of some off-kilter, syncopated rhymes. Every roadman is a sweet boy if the DJ plays Heartbroken at just the right time for these jaded feet. Those rhythms are coming back. It's like a new track's been played and we're hearing the music buzzing around the nightclub again. At least that's what it's like in my head. It's important also to notice that Chingonyi brings this idea to life by using two figures from UK street consciousness. We have the roadman, a combative and often dangerous figure. And then we have the sweet boy, who's a more romantic, maybe an image-conscious character. And in fact, Kayo Chingonyi has actually presented this before in a talk he gave at the University of Liverpool here. I don't want to fall in love, the figure of the sweet boy in grime. And we have this lovely idea that Chingonyi has here, that the figure of the sweet boy is a slang term characterizing a man who embodies vulnerability, tenderness, and a form of chivalric eros. So the right song can turn the roadman into a sweet boy, and the poet is highlighting the transformative power of music. And what's even more striking is that Chingonyi does this by drawing a direct connection between the Paradise Garage of 1970s, 1980s New York and the contemporary realities of UK street cultures. Notice how this is all contained in one sentence. We start at King Street and Larry Levan, and we end at T2 and Heartbroken. And this shift from Roadman to Sweet Boy also changes how we understand the metaphorical phrase cutting shapes. Now, on one level, many of us will know that this is slang for dancing, but the word cutting also has some violent connotations, particularly in the context of UK street culture, mentions of roadmen, and knife crime. So something's happening here where even the phrase, the language cutting shapes, is also being transformed by music into something that is creative and expressive and joyful. And we obviously can't move on without mentioning the piece of music at the heart of this section, which is T2's UK garage classic, Heartbroken. And in many ways, this track sort of captures the entire idea of this contradiction, where we have romantic vocals that are layered over a sort of gritty and fast-paced instrumental. It sort of perfectly reflects the tensions and transformations that the poet is trying to represent at this part of the poem. I'm heartbroken. And finally, I love this closing image here, these jaded feet. And I think whenever you're reading poetry, it's important to develop a sensitivity to any phrase or word that jumps out at you. And when I read this, the word jaded just really, really jumped out at me. And first of all, we have this sort of the closeness of it being these jaded feet. And it feels like the poet's talking about himself or about those in his immediate community. And then the word jaded itself, I think, has a sort of double meaning here. As we can see, jaded on a sort of surface level could be just physical exhaustion, fatigued by overwork. Perhaps he's saying that they're all exhausted from dancing so long and just this song energizes them in a new way. But I think looking at that second meaning, it does hint at a sort of emotional exhaustion and a kind of disillusionment with life. And I don't want to focus too much on this, but I think jaded here could speak directly to the more destructive elements of a culture, something more related to the roadman and that particular type of machismo. And perhaps these jaded feet are symbols of limited opportunities, of boredom, or a general disillusionment with society. And maybe Chingonyi here is wanting to point out that music holds a restorative power and a way to reconnect this generation with its heritage and perhaps offer some sort of release or maybe even sort of cultural healing. Okay, in the next section of the poem, the mysterious you is addressed directly.
Teach us to shapeshift, Legba. You must know I'd know your customary shuffle anywhere, that I see your hand in the abandon of a couple, middle of the floor, sliding quick and slick as a skin fade, by the hand of a Puerto Rican clipper man who wields a cutthroat like a paintbrush.
So, first of all, we're introduced to the character Legba. And Legba is a deity who's recognized in various religions across West Africa, the Caribbean, and voodoo culture, and obviously communities around the world that have connections to these parts of the world. Legba is often seen as a spiritual figure who enables communication between humans and the spirit world. So again, thinking about communication, thinking about connections. Notice here that the speaker of the poem is using this collective pronoun us. Teach us to shapeshift, Legba. So he's sort of representing his community and it's making a plea to this deity that offers connection, that offers communication. An interesting question here is, what does it mean to shapeshift? And this is one that perhaps I haven't got an answer for, and I'll be interested to hear. So in the comments, what does the poet feel, what does the speaker feel that his community needs to shift or change into? Be an interesting way of unlocking the meaning of this poem.
Legba is a Loa who is the link between the visible mortal world and the invisible immortal realms. He is the means and avenue between them, the vertical axis of the universe. As guardian of the sacred gateway, it is he who grants contact with the other Loa. Legba must be the first Loa to be ritually saluted if this is to be achieved.
Okay, so that's Legba, and then we get this idea of the speaker saying that I'd know your customary shuffle, that phantom limp anywhere. And now this could be a reference to Legba himself. He's often depicted as sort of an old, frail man. So maybe it's saying that, literally the figure of Legba is often walking with a sort of limp to his step. And the word phantom here really reinforces this idea of it being a sort of spirit or a ghostly figure that we're appealing to. However, at the same time, these words shuffle and limp, and considering that the poem takes place in a nightclub environment, it could also be referring to dance styles that are rooted in black music and dance culture. And these physical movements often mirror the syncopated rhythms that have been running through the entire poem. The poet identifies the energy of music and dance itself as the spirit of Legba. And I think we can see in sort of contemporary music how these sorts of movements, shuffling and limping, is a part of expression. And I mean, I'll link to a video that explores the importance of social dance, especially in black communities around the world. Okay, so we've appealed to Legba, and the speaker has said that I can see you anywhere. And one of the places that he sees Legba is back on the dance floor. And we assume we're back in Paradise Garage. We're back in the memory. What we have here is we get these syncopated rhythms returning. And we get the use of internal rhyme. So words like hand and abandon, quick and slick. So internal rhyme, words that rhyme on the same line in a poem. And it produces again this musical rolling rhythm. And also notice how the pace of the poem picks up here through the use of monosyllabic words. Sliding quick and slick as a skin fade by the hand of a Puerto Rican clipperman. So these use of monosyllabic words really speeds up, and it almost feels like it's mimicking the rush of adrenaline and that sense of climax on the dance floor itself. And now to describe the couple dancing here, the couple at the heart of all this, the poet takes us through a sequence of vivid similes. The couples dancing, their movements are quick and precise, like a barber performing a skin fade haircut. And that barber uses a cutthroat razor that's wielded like a paintbrush. And once again, there's that ongoing theme that there's language of imagery and danger and violence. Think about the words wield. Think about the word cutthroat. I mean, it's completely imbued with violence. However, in this context, it's reimagined as something that represents creativity and beauty and self-expression. So there's this duality, this line between danger and beauty, between aggression and artistry. And it's one of the central ideas of the poem, and especially how music and dance can help transform something destructive into something that's really constructive. This is a really beautiful moment where we're sort of transported from the dance floor via the skin fades to barbershop culture. This poem's all about connections, and it's important to think about the skin fade and the barbershop as key elements of black masculine identity.
People never understand. They're like, why do you need to fly a barber out to get that? I could do that for you. I'm like, I don't think you quite understand what a fade is.
Also, it's worth noticing that Chingonyi points out the barber himself is Puerto Rican, and the gender of the dancing couple is never specified. So I think this reinforces one of the poem's most beautiful undercurrents. The spirit of the Paradise Garage was all about acceptance and expression, and we're breaking down boundaries between gender, race, sexuality, nationality, and class. And I think ultimately what Chingonyi is doing is encouraging us to think about how these seemingly separate elements of culture, whether it's music or dance or street life or gender identity or spirituality, they're all connected. To think about how can we create spaces or environments where this interconnectedness can thrive.
Let us become like them, an ode to night, ordering beer in a corporeal language from a barman who replies by sweeping his arms in an arc, Willy Ninja style. To fix a drink our lips will yearn for, a taste we've been trying to recreate ever since.
So the final sentence of the poem continues what we've seen previously, continuing to make a request from Legba But things start to shift slightly as we go towards the conclusion of the poem. We feel like we're looking again at this couple who are already lost in the music on the dance floor. And he sort of plays quite beautifully using enjambment with this phrase, an ode to night. And the way that it's split across two lines like this, I can't help but feel like this is another allusion, a very different sort of allusion to Keats's poem, a very famous poem, Ode to a Nightingale. And this is often held up as one of the great canonical works of romantic poetry. Perhaps Chingonyi is making a separate point here that the value of nightclub culture, of dance music, of places like Paradise Garage and DJs like Larry Levan, they should be held on an equal footing with so-called high art like romantic poetry, like an Ode to a Nightingale. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, but that did jump out at me. Okay. We are then shifting locations in the nightclub. We're going from the dance floor to the bar, ordering beer in a corporeal language. And this moment brings in another layered allusion, which is this time to Willy Ninja. So the barman, in response to their request, sweeps his arms in an arc. Lovely alliteration there. Willy Ninja style. Now, Willy Ninja is a legendary figure in 1980s New York queer culture. He's considered by many to be the creator of the dance style known as voguing, and it places us firmly in the historical context of queer ballrooms and black and brown LGBTQ spaces where dance was a form of survival, communication, and identity. And I think this phrase, corporeal language, and this explicit reference to dance and movement are actually quite crucial, because throughout the poem, Chingonyi celebrates forms of communication that don't rely on written or spoken language. And that's perhaps another reason why Ode to a Nightingale is only hinted at. It's sort of marginalized in the poem. So instead of text, music, dance, sound, taste, body language, these all become meaningful as ways to express identity and heritage and joy and grief. And there's beauty here in the simple acts of cutting hair or dancing or ordering a drink and just sharing space with others. However, there is a sadness towards the end of this poem. We fix a drink our lips will yearn for, a taste we've been trying to recreate ever since. So this final image, a drink at the bar, it's just tinged with longing and maybe even regret. And it encapsulates a central tension of the poem. This is, on the one hand, a really powerful celebration of Black cultural spaces and legacies, but it's one that also recognises how easily these spaces are lost or forgotten or undervalued by modern society. And it sort of echoes a little bit the dancing on the grave that we spoke about earlier. And perhaps this idea that we're trying to recreate this taste is actually a comment on the dangers of nostalgia and that the futility of trying to return to the past. But either way, this final sentence of the poem is very much a plea to the spiritual realm. Let us become like them. And it carries a sense of urgency and desperation to reconnect with this bygone form of freedom and joy and self-expression. And actually something to think about is that what we have in this poem is a request to the spiritual realm for some form of salvation. Now, this is very much a prayer in many respects. It fits the definition wonderfully. So that's something to think about also. Is this poem just a prayer? Is it just the speaker asking for some sort of salvation or help from the spiritual realm of Legba? And finally, there's possibly a bittersweet joke here, which is hidden in the word fix. Now, on one level, fix is obviously referring to pouring a drink. We say fixing a drink. It's part of idiomatic language, part of parlance. But maybe there is this idea that something needs to be fixed. So there's this hope that this moment, this night, this space, this music could somehow fix or heal the speaker and the community he's part of. Or maybe it's even a way of fixing a cultural memory that feels on the brink of being lost. So, reflecting on the poem as a whole, on first glance, it reads like a celebration of Black culture, especially as expressed through dance music and all these wonderful influences and inspirations that have shaped it over time. But when you look more closely, it becomes clear that the poem is a lot more complex And there's something here that's troubling too. The second half of the poem and the way that it sort of desperately appeals to Legba seems to suggest that the speaker, on behalf of a wider community, is reaching out for spiritual reconnection, wanting to regain a certain energy or spirit that was present in the acceptance and self-expression of a place like the Paradise Garage. And maybe it's by reconnecting with this cultural heritage, this musical and communal legacy that the community Chingonyi speaks for can transcend violence and conflict and social disillusionment that's discreetly referenced here in the poem, and that is often linked to masculine. These are sort of masculine spaces and masculine crises of violence and self-acceptance. So by including all these allusions and references, Chingonyi is showing us how these cultural threads are all connected, and that how so much of contemporary Black identity, particularly, as I've said, masculine identity and expression, draws on generations of inherited creativity, survival, and transformation. Now, I've broken the poem into sections here, but it's worth looking at it now and stepping back to remember that this is written as one long, continuous stanza, all with its irregularities and different sound patterns and alliteration, rhyme, internal rhyme, sibilance. Maybe it reflects the nature of a nightclub itself. You know, the music never stops until the night ends or the sun comes up, or sometimes even beyond that. And instead of having a rigid rhyme scheme, these patterns of sounds create a more fluid and organic feeling. So maybe it is a reflection of the nightclub, a reflection of Paradise Garage. But the form itself also reflects this idea of unity, how different elements and histories are connected, how one moment bleeds into the next, how one sound influenced the next. And I think this formal oneness maybe represents the poet's own desire for cultural and spiritual wholeness. It's a longing for a community that isn't fragmented by conflict or cultural erasure, but instead one that finds healing and meaning on the dance floor and in the barbershop and in these moments of shared joy and expression. I think that's all I've got to say for the time being, but there is so much more to this poem. I really enjoyed it. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and it's a great introduction to Kaio Chingonyi's work. Every time I've come back to it, I find something different, and I'm sure there's so much I've missed. So please leave me a comment and let's start a conversation. And feel free to post your own ideas about what you think this poem's all about, because that's what a wonderful poem like this can do, is it can be a starting point for conversations about so many different things. Okay, I will be looking at more Kaio Chingonyi poems in the future, but for now, thank you very much for watching.